Hey everybody, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to be taking a look at Chapter 17, which is all about speciation. So speciation is the divergence of lineages and the emergence of reproductive isolation between lineages, which is a fancy way of saying it is the origination of separated species of organisms. So as the slide here presents, there's kind of this seemingly simple question, but like a lot of things in this class, if you dig into it, you see why it's complicated. This idea of like, what are species? Like, what is this idea of even having species? Because at the end of the day, nothing's quite black or white in biology. And so when we talk about a species, we have to come up with a definition of what makes these two organisms distinctly separated. And at the end of the day, all that really means is that we are prescribing them different words to define what they are. So this is a very sort of human defined thing. However, science likes concrete, definitions of what things are. And so there's some qualifications that we have to talk about in order to sort of reach a point where something is different enough from another organism to classify it as a separate species. So species are groups of organisms that mate with one another is the traditional biological view. Historically, a lot of that has been morphological. And so the Linnaeus in the Linnaean system described species based upon their appearance. This was pre genetic analysis and things like that. And so it made sense that when you look at organisms, you can notice, key distinct characteristics that are different between them. And that's how we can know that these are separate species. However, that runs into some problems because a lot of species have members that may look totally different. For instance, like male-female in birds. And then also we have some species that are separate from each other but look very, very similar, and we call those cryptic species. So there's problems with taking a morphological viewpoint. Biological viewpoint is they can't mate. Morphological is they look different. There's also a phylogenetic view of species, which is taking into account much more the specific genetic differences between them. And there are examples of organisms which can interbreed, however, have been identified as significantly enough genetically different to warrant classification as a separate species. So it's not quite cut and dry how we define species, and that's not really a problem. That's not a bad thing. That's not saying that science is stupid or anything like that. It's sort of a attribute of just acknowledging that it's complicated. So here you can see an example of here's two male ducks from Florida and California, and you can notice how even though they're the same species, they do have some morphological differences in terms of the coloration and things like that. And then you bring into it the female, and it's wildly different, and that's because of sexual selection and things like that. But if you were to just put these in front of somebody and say, hey, which two are related, this would, I'm sure, be the odd duck out. Here's an example of cryptic species. Now, these are two different species, and probably looking at it, it kind of is clear from the coloration. But, if you consider just all the other features of it, they're very similar frogs. And so it's not immediately obvious that these would not be able to breed with one another. So biological, these are groups that are actually or potentially interbreeding populations. And the Linnaean version of this would be morphologically based. So speciation requires an interruption of gene flow. And what that means is that we need some way to take a population of organisms and to split it into two and keep them separated somehow. And there's different degrees to which this can occur. But the point of them being separated is that by remaining separate and by experiencing unequal selection or different selection because of whatever their natural environment is or their food source or whatever, that's going to sort of steer them on a different evolutionary path. Because if two organisms, even if they live right next to each other, if they're feeding on different things and relying on different foods, these populations, and that persists long enough, the traits that become beneficial for one are going to be different than the traits that are beneficial for another. And so that selection is going to start diverging them and veering them onto different paths where, after tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of generations or whatever, some extremely long period of time, they will have accumulated enough genetic differences that for any of a variety of reasons, they'll no longer be compatible with each other, and they'll meet that biological definition of species. So there's different ways in which this can happen in terms of the division of it. And here's just an example of, you have some ancestral population, and that could lead to two different paths, two different genotypes and maybe phenotypes. An example here, let's see. We have chromosomal rearrangement. So weirder things can happen genetically. We're not going to go into so many of those examples, but just understand that there's a variety of reasons by which big differences can occur within organisms, and it depends a lot upon the genetics of that specific organism as well as the environment that it lives in. And you can look in the book for more information about these different examples. However, what is clear is that as species diverge from one another, that reproductive isolation increases. So as we get differences genetically, they become this phrase reproductive isolation refers to the fact that they can no longer reproduce with each other. And so here's an example that as we move to the right here with increasing genetic divergence, you notice that we get increasing reproductive isolation, which again shouldn't be terribly surprising, right? If you think about like a cat and a dog, they can't breed together because they are genetically so different that even if like in a lab somewhere you took the sperm of one, the egg of another, and you threw them together, the chromosomes, like the exact number of chromosomes, whether they're homologous to each other, like none of that will work. And so you're not going to be able to successfully reproduce two fundamentally different organisms. So as those genetic differences add up, that's the problem that you run into. So there's different types of speciation. We're going to talk about allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is real simple. This is when there is a geographic barrier, something different. You have a population of organisms, they wander off because of competition, they end up on two sides of a mountain, of a river, of whatever. They are separated somehow. So they are now physically in two different places. They are experiencing two different types of selective forces, even if they're very similar, just by virtue of the fact that they are separated. Genetic drift and other things are going to introduce different changes and different allele frequencies and things like that. These are going to build up differences and become eventually reproductively isolated. So here's an example with fish. And I think this was as a glacial movement through the eastern half of the United States, leading to basically two pockets of these fish that eventually gave rise to different species because of their separation. So another great example would be Darwin and the Finches. All these different islands, and you have this ancestral finch that came from the mainland and then eventually diverged into all these different species because of the competition, which drove sort of a separation of these birds, which then allowed for the opportunity for them to be selected for just different environments that existed on the various islands that they found themselves. Okay, so allopatric, real simple, separated. Sympatric is a little trickier because this is where you have populations that diverge even though they are persisting within the same environment. And one way to kind of more easily understand this is the idea of microenvironments. I think I talked about that somewhere in here. Microhabitats. So this can happen if you sort of zoom in on the fact that geographic barriers don't have to be mountain ranges or rivers. Geographic barriers could be, one side of a clearing and the other side of a clearing in a forest. So some organisms just don't have range that carries them over, tons of miles or whatever in their lifetime. Sometimes, maybe in the case of insects, they may have very short lives that even though they're 100 meters apart, that's a big enough difference that those two populations are no longer, flowing in between each other. There's no migration. And an example would be these maggot flies, and this is a famous example where basically you have these flies that lay their eggs on what's called hawthorn fruits, and then you had some flies who maybe totally by chance just landed on some apple trees and succeeded in laying their eggs and succeeded in having their young survive, even though it's on a totally different fruit. And so now you have this situation where you have sort of two different groups, one that's surviving on apple trees, one that's surviving on these hawthorn fruits. And even though those two trees may be right next to each other, they are separated, and with time they can become reproductively isolated to the point that now we have two different species of maggot flies from this example. So reproductive isolation also may be incomplete. And so what that means is, like, so they separate, maybe they start developing some differences, but they come back together in some way, or that overlap persists. In that case, you can end up with hybridization. The whole point of forming a hybrid is that maybe there's not enough differences to really produce the inability to reproduce, but instead they have differences, but when they come together, you end up with this mixture of the two. Oftentimes, though, that's going to bring with it reduced survivability, that the hybrid is going to probably lack some key characteristics that made either of the two species successful, and because it's kind of a mix in the middle, it's not going to thrive. So even though it can exist, it long-term probably won't win out, and so that speciation will continue despite the fact that you do have some overlap. And there's been lots of examples of those as well. The two mechanisms ultimately are grouped into what are called pre-zygotic and post-zygotic, and you should be responsible for, or you are responsible for knowing the difference between these, but don't overthink it. A zygote is the formed embryo between an egg and a sperm. So when we say pre-zygotic, what we're saying is before the act of reproduction could have happened. So pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms prevent the formation of an embryo. They prevent the actual reproduction. Post-zygotic isolation is after the embryo has formed, what could prevent that organism, that offspring, from succeeding. Some pre-zygotic mechanisms. The first one is mechanical isolation, and this is just physical body differences that prevent these organisms from being able to reproduce with one another. So it says in plants it may involve pollinators. So if you have one insect that's pollinating one plant and that insect does not pollinate this other group of plants, that's now a pre-zygotic barrier. So even though maybe they could, if you got pollen from one to the ovum of another, maybe they could reproduce, but they just don't have the right overlap in pollinators, and so they remain separated, and then enough time passes and eventually they're now genetically incompatible. Another example of that, and probably my favorite, is left-handed and right-handed snails, which sounds goofy, but if you think about a snail, the spiral direction of a snail's shell could go in either direction. So if you're looking at it, that with the sort of point spire end of the shell pointed upwards, you could have the opening on the left or on the right. And so if you think about two snails that are hanging out next to each other and they just can't line things up, that's an example of mechanical isolation. Temporal isolation, so temporal refers to time. And this comes down to the fact that species may be out at different times of the day. They may be breeding at different times of the day. Any number of things that just basically prevent them from interacting with each other at the same time, at the same place. Maybe they live in the same region. However, because in the case of, let's say, frogs, because they come out at different times, or because they, I think the example with frogs is the breeding season of frogs. Frequency of egg laying occurring between these different species at different times, they remain isolated from one another. And this is an example of some allopatric populations. So these are separated geographically, and you notice there's a bit of overlap in the breeding period here. However, sympatric, if they are existing within the same environment, in order for these to have differentiated into three different species, you notice that they have pretty notably different reproductive periods. And so what that means is even though these are three frogs that all live in the same place, they are reproducing at fundamentally different times, which means that they are no longer going to be intermixing between each other. And so even though they may be living in the same environment, from a reproductive standpoint, they have managed to become isolated, even though they are in the same place. They're just doing things at different times. So that's temporal isolation. Behavioral is like songbirds and their different mating calls and things like that. Mating calls of frogs, the coloration of male cichlids, just any of the types of things that come down to basically the behavior and the dance of the blue-footed booby. You can't Google that on your computers, I'm sorry. That is another example of behavioral isolation. So the behaviors dictate the fact that, okay, you may be both like ducks hanging out next to each other, but if this one's not doing the right dance, this one's not interested. And so that can be a reproductive isolation mechanism. And that these are all pre-zygotic, right? So all of these things prevent the formation of a zygote because they result in these things just not being able to reproduce. Not being able to in the case of mechanical, not having the right timing for it for temporal, or just not having the interest to do it in the case of behavioral. Okay. So, and there's some other examples here. Here's a hummingbird. Pollinators are a really good example of a prezygotic mechanism. Here's a hummingbird. It's a humming bee. We have these around here every once in a while. They're kind of cool to look at. Flowers are cool, I guess. All right. Some other ones, habitat isolation. So this is like allopatric. This is real simple, that if they are isolated physically in different places. Gametic isolation, so sperm and eggs of different species simply don't fuse, right? That even if, again, you've got them in the right place at the right time, in a lab or something, that chemically they're just not able to interact. And so that would be all examples of pre-zygotic isolation. Post-zygotic, this is where you start to get genetic differences that result in hybrid offspring that have low viability or infertility. So what I mean by low viability is that the ability or the success of the embryo to actually grow into a functioning organism and be born and succeed is significantly lowered because of genetic differences between the two parents. In the case of hybrid infertility, this is where you get things like a mule. And so a mule is actually a mix between a donkey and a horse. A donkey and a horse are different species. We don't have to argue about whether or not they should be. They have clear morphological differences. And even though they can produce young between each other, they don't produce young that are fertile. And so, yes, you get a mule, but that mule will not be able to have young of its own. And if you're curious about that, it basically comes down to the fact that horses have 2 more chromosomes than donkeys. I might have that backwards. One of them has 2 more chromosomes than the other. And so the resulting embryo between the two has an odd number of chromosomes because it inherited 1 extra chromosome from one of its parents, the sperm or egg. And so now you have this organism with a 50-50 mix mostly, but with this extra chromosome. And when you start thinking about how that would line up with the another mule, even though they can certainly attempt to reproduce, there's extremely low likelihood that the sperm and egg will be successful in producing a new generation of mules, just because of the significant differences and sort of randomness in the mix of horse and donkey chromosomes that the two mules have. It's not impossible, but it is extremely low likelihood, low enough that we consider them to be infertile. So all of these things serve to create basically the definition of separating different species. There's a little bit more information about pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. There's a cool diagram here of hybrid zones. So basically here's 2 frogs that are 2 different species, but there's this hybrid zone here through Eastern Europe where you see basically this blending of the two. However, as it said here, they may persist for long periods of time, but probably one sort of species or the other is going to win out. And what I mean by that is this hybrid zone will sort of close up as these two species, the red and the yellow regions, kind of become more and more distinct from each other. They probably will continue to outcompete the hybrids, and so that may close up and you may just end up with one species of frog that lives over here and one species here. That's it about speciation. If you have questions, please let me know.